government. How does the Constitution limit each set of powers? What issues did the Philadelphia Convention leave unaddressed, and what have been the consequences of the failure to address them? And begin the round.
Political scientist Herbert Crawley recognized that the Constitution was by no means comprehensive, but that it established an important relationship between the federal government and the states when he explained that the combination of federalism and republicanism did not constitute a progressive and formative political principle, but it pointed in the direction of a constructive formula.
The Constitution balances state and national powers by setting forth and limiting the powers of the federal government, leaving all other duties to the states, and in turn limiting states' powers. For example, in Article 1, Section 8 specifically outlines Congress's authority to give its enumerated powers to lay and collect taxes. Clause 18 of the same section gives Congress all the powers necessary and proper to carry out its enumerated duties.
The Constitution gives the federal government precedent over the states in Article 6, Section 2, declaring acts of the federal government the supreme law of the land. However, Article 1, Section 9 places limits on the federal government by barring it from restricting habeas corpus, passing ex post facto laws and bills of attainder, just to name a few.
Nevertheless, the states are arguably given just as much power as the federal government through Article 1, Section 1's creation of the Electoral College, which allows each state to appoint presidential electors, and through Article 1, Section 4, which allows each state to set the time, place, and manner of its congressional elections. Like the federal government, their powers are limited in Article 1, Section 10, which bars them from measures like passing ex post facto laws or bills of attainder, and prohibits them from entering into alliances.
The full faith and credit clause in Article 4 gives more power to individual states. For example, the Supreme Court has agreed to hear the case of Perry versus Schwarzenegger, which will determine the constitutionality of California's ban on gay marriage. If the Supreme Court rules in favor of Perry, states that allow gay marriage will be given additional power because gay marriages that occur in one state must be recognized by every other state. The Constitution limits each branch of government through checks and balances. The judicial branch, established in Article 3, checks the executive and legislative branch because justices are free of executive control and may declare executive and legislative action to be unconstitutional through judicial review, established in 1803 in Marbury v. Madison.
Furthermore, the President checks the judiciary by having the power to appoint Supreme Court justices. The President also checks the legislative by vetoing legislation. Finally, the legislative checks the executive by overriding a presidential veto, removing the President through impeachment, and approving all treaties and presidential appointments. It checks the judiciary by creating lower courts, removing judges through impeachment, and approving or rejecting the appointment of judges. The executive also checks both branches with the power to enforce laws via executive order.
The Philadelphia Convention failed to define citizenship and address the issue of slavery by delaying congressional action on the matter until 1808 via Article 1. These issues contributed to sectionalism stemming from the Dred Scott decision and eventually culminated in the Civil War and eventually the 13th and 14th Amendments. The convention also did not address the right of a state to secede from the Union, which was denied by President Lincoln, who said, "No government proper ever had provision in its organic law for its own termination."
Eventually, the Supreme Court ruled the right to secede unconstitutional in Texas v. White. The Constitution also never addressed circumstances in which the right to vote could be denied. Repercussions included Jim Crow laws like the Grandfather Clause that disenfranchised African Americans, and the denial of suffrage to women until 1920, when the 19th Amendment was passed. Though the Philadelphia Convention failed to address certain issues and was by no means perfect, it established an important balance of power between the federal government and the states. Thus, Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes best embodied the spirit of the Constitution when he referred to it as an experiment, as all life is an experiment. Thank you.
Does the 10th Amendment give too much powers to the states or the national government?
No, the 10th Amendment does not, because if we would look until the 10th Amendment was there, the only powers that were given to the states were like time, place, and manner, or giving or sending people to the Electoral College to vote for the president. The 10th Amendment then allows power to give power to the state to until so they could define citizenship until the 14th Amendment, or also they could set their own rules of how for like speed limits or their own healthcare.
10th Amendment also gives states more powers to become more laboratories of democracy. For example, in the 1990s when Tommy Thompson practiced welfare policies that later influenced other states and the federal government.
The 10th Amendment does give too much power to the states, but it's also too important to remember that it leaves all powers not given to the government to the people as well. And so it gives too much power to the states because it's essentially an open-ended clause that allows them to do potentially anything that's not limited under the Constitution. So states can do, for example, as South Carolina tried to do, nullify federal laws because they felt that that was a power that they could have under the 10th Amendment. Now, the question is whether or not this is good. And ultimately it is because, as we said, it's an important check on the federal government's power and it prevents the federal government from infringing upon the states.
And also, it's argued, especially from the Federalist standpoint, that it did have too much power because, as enumerated in many of the Federalist Papers, including 1, 13, and 32, they basically said that they have to have a strong national government in order to control the people and control. Sorry.
It's okay.
What does it mean when the Constitution says that the federal government owes each state government a republican form of government?
Well, it's important to note that that is the only guarantee that the federal government has given to the states. And what that means is that the federal government has a responsibility to ensure that each state is not violating the rights of its citizens. In other words, the debate between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, when the Anti-Federalists said that there should be a Bill of Rights, the Federalists said that the Constitution already has a Bill of Rights, and one of their main arguments for that was a guarantee of a republican form of government. They felt that that wouldn't violate natural rights like life, liberty, and property.
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question? I don't
Sure,
think
in
it
Article
was
4 of the Constitution, it says that the federal government must guarantee to each state that each state may operate and must have what is called a quote-unquote republican form of government. Effectively, what does that mean? What is a republican form of government?
Wait, go ahead.
It means that each state has its power to go about laws which they find appropriate for their specific state. For example, in Alabama, how they have immigration laws that they find problems with immigrants, so they have to make certain laws for their state, unlike other states who probably don't have that certain problem.
And also, this is enumerated through the way that each state has its own constitution. They can decide laws and make laws as long as it's not enumerated in the United States Constitution. So this is a form of the republican government that the states have.
You guys talked a lot about the checks and balances of the national government in your testimony. How do those help or hurt the states?
So checks and balances?
Yeah, amongst the different branches of the federal government.
The way that this helps balance out the power between the federal government and the states is just that when the colonies came over here, they were afraid of a tyranny. They weren't afraid of the parliament. They didn't want a monarchy. So when the executive branch came in, it was that kind of idea of like one person is going to be in head of the whole entire state. So this is one way for like how one branch can make sure that the other branch isn't going to gain any power while the other one doesn't as well. So it's kind of like this free-flowing circle to where everyone has a say in how government should be run, but no one can gain or lose power.
Another example would be having Congress, with Congress's power being able to tax, as James Wilson said in a speech he gave in 1787, that Congress being able to tax will preserve the common good for all states, have a standing army for the country, and also preserve the dignity of the Union, which will all benefit all states.
In the Virginia Plan, one of James Madison's big argument was that the legislative branch is the branch of the people. It's not a branch of the federal government. The Senate is 2 senators from each state. They represent the states. And so any checks that the legislative has on other branches, like the president, like impeachment, like we talked about in our testimony, that's a check that the states and the people have on the government as well. So that's a representation of the states checking the other branches of government via the legislature.
Certain states have certain laws that go against the federal government, such as gay marriage, medicinal marijuana, or immigration. How does this infringe on states' rights if the federal government comes into play, saying seizing certain medicinal dispensaries or infringing on a state's right for immigration control?
Well,
Is this infringing on their rights or is it not?
it's not an infringement on the state's rights. The supremacy clause in the Constitution says that the Constitution and the laws thereof made by the federal government are the supreme law of the land. So it is not an infringement on the rights of the states. It is the right of the federal government to make laws that govern the states. And the states can make laws that they see fit as long as they don't violate federal laws. So a state that wants to uphold gay marriage does not violate a federal law, but a state that wants to practice, medicinal marijuana is going to have some problems because of the supremacy clause.
Take a deep breath. Go ahead.
Can I see that pen?
Yes. Checks and balances to the states, right, Nick? That was your question,
Yeah.
essentially?
Okay, just because when I was listening to testimony and just looking at the question, the main question is comparing the state to the national government. I thought I heard a lot of national comparisons, so that's why I presented the question.
Courts. You guys didn't talk about the Supreme Court at all? And then maybe something for your testimony you may consider just a brief change. Especially incorporation. It has both a positive and negative effect on states. It has definitely an effect on the people. President using executive orders, such as the one to help the students in the Little Rock 9 and let them get in Little Rock, Arkansas. Helping states. Did you guys talk about the Senate and the fact that they represent states versus not proportional representation? Anybody else?
I'm gonna piggyback with Nick with the idea that, I remember last time that I heard this question, kind of hammered you guys a little bit about the idea that when you guys talk about the veto and all the horizontal, the separation of powers, checks and balances, it literally has nothing to do with the question that's asked. And like right in the middle, right smack in the middle of the testimony is this whole thing about checks and balances, and it's your answer starts off awesome with bold and talking about all these issues, and then you kind of skew off into this tangent, and then from there you get back kind of into state versus federal bill when you start talking about nullification and secession, which is definitely out of the Philadelphia Convention. Remember that everything here, you have to unite the thread. You have to look and see like how all three of the questions are united. They're not just independent questions. And when it says how does the Constitution limit each set of power, it's talking about the limitations on state powers and national government. And when it talks about the issues did the Philadelphia Convention leave unaddressed, slavery is okay, but only if you're talking about it in the context of what the federal government can do vis-a-vis the states with regard to slavery. Federalism, the up-down checks and balances, that's the sole focus of the question. And I think you guys, if I'm a judge and I'm listening to that, I would think that you'd miss the point of the question. You guys do need to change that. I'm emphatic about it. You do need to change that and get more on top of what you were first talking about. Having said that, you guys started off a little bit weak in cross-sex, and then you got better as it went on. Adam, they were afraid of Parliament. Parliament passed the Stamp Act.
Okay, that was the one book that I read, and they said that they didn't mind Parliament, they're afraid of the monarchy.
Well, I think maybe the rephrase then would be they didn't mind.
They didn't mind
The
the
idea of
the
legislative.
concept, but
Right,
Okay.
legislative authority, but Parliament and the King and the Crown were one.
okay.
So, that's all I have for now.
That's why I asked the question. I just thought there wasn't enough state versus national. That's how I read the question. And with that, I always thought, whether right or wrong, I kind of thought the states boiled down to the individuals that made up each state. So whatever helps them helps the state. Whatever gives them more power. So I really thought the 14th Amendment's big in state powers. So those are just some things I thought. I did think a lot of the questions were answered well. That was just my overarching problem with the whole question.
That's good.
We've kind of hit on it all. One thing that's more team-wise is you hear, I think it was in the beginning of the first question when you were trying to come up with examples. If you have one on the top of your head, just come in and be like, this is what my colleague's trying to say, or this is another good example you might be trying to think of. Come in and save them, help them out, bring it to a different point. Because when he goes like that, you start to wonder as a judge and be like, does he actually know the material? And then another teammate can come in and help him out and be like, okay, he does. He knows it. He should know it too. So that's the one big
It's
thing.
it's as if you're one unit.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like you're one person.
Exactly. So work like that.
Fumble recovery.
During,
Exactly.
you guys are 357 in time.
Exactly.
You guys did a decent job of eye contact, focusing on. But at one time I looked up, and all three of you who were not presenting were thumbing through the iPads at the same time. So you got to make sure that I know who's ever coming up next should be up, set. Everybody else should be kind of focused, back at the judges, back to being focused. So this is one thing I noticed with that. That first question, I think Adam let it off, Gabby came in, Nathaniel came in, and then Sarah, you kind of try to bring it home. You guys were 2 minutes into that question by the time it got to you. Don't answer it, okay? You don't need to jump in on that one. Just make sure that you balance, you realize that she hasn't answered so she can jump in, okay? It's not that you gave a bad answer, you guys need more questions, okay? And it was hit pretty well, and your point was right on. Just you gotta also listen to the questions and go, okay, I don't need to answer, and move on to the
What do you
next.
guys think about, I don't know, like, just one thing I thought about, like, asking to repeat the question, I don't know, because Sarah did that, I don't know.
Not a problem.
It's not an issue.
It's not really.
Well,
Just
my
don't do it 5 times in a row.
Like
Yeah,
my
exactly.
thing was, I legitimately did not like comprehend your question, and I saw the looks on their faces, and I don't know if you, like, I
Well, that's totally
yeah,
fine,
so-
because,
and
you
I'm
know.
just like,
I
No
bought
problem.
time with it. I would buy.
Yeah, no, it's a good move because sometimes they'll rephrase it and it might be rephrased differently to the point where you understand it
And it
better.
also gives you a few extra minutes to
Yeah,
kind
it does. It gives you
of,
other
nothing wrong
teammates.
with it.
But just like you said, don't do it question after question after question.
Right.
And with that,
No problem.
Republican form of government, you guys define what a Republican form of government is.
Yeah, I forgot.
Actually, it's pretty good, yeah, because that's a really unsettled question. We had
Yeah.
when we talked to David Skaggs, I actually got some stuff that I might be able to throw your way.
Will you can you email that federalism stuff too, for our testimony?
Yeah,
Um,
the stuff that I taught.
You gotta go,
Yeah.
first and foremost, they gotta have people who are elected by the people representing them. First and foremost, that's what it guarantees. And it also guarantees that the members who are elected from those states get their seats in Congress. Those are not denied to them unless we have, they're in felony or something else that, breach of the peace or treason, but besides that, they get their seats. Remember we talked about, they get elected KKK, swastika wearing, women hater, but they were elected from that state, they get their seat in Congress.
Right.
So, those are things that they still get,
So it's like they get to choose their own
they
government.
get to choose a representative government.
Representative.
Right. And
That's
also,
really good.
and there's an interesting, I mean, I guess I don't know how much time we have.
Let's not, right now.
Yeah,
We can
so,
talk
but
about
I can talk, I'll send you that stuff.
Thanks.
Yeah.
it. Good.
Talk to you about helping that middle part of the testimony.
Yes, we can do that.
Class.
Yeah, that's easy.
Did you guys get the
I don't think you stopped the video.
Thank you.
Well, you know,